What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. This is going to be a podcast segment. The topic of discussion is going to be what was MMA like in the beginning, or close to like the start when it started getting popular, when it got on pay-per-view. And of course, I'm just going to speak from my personal experience. All right, so the first UFCs were like early 90s, mid 90s. I think like 1993 was the first UFC event, and I was really young. But I was old enough to remember like all the fights and remember like how I felt about watching, you know, these quote no holds barred fights. And back in the day, there was like a lot less rules. There were, you know, you could strike to the nuts. There were nut shots. Headbutts. Mark the Hammer Coleman was an absolute savage with the headbutts. And I remember like, you know, watching these fights, they were super exciting because it was like a real blood sport. You know, back in the day, like guys were like more catered to like one style. So it truly was like, you know, what style is the best. So you would have like Taekwondo dude versus you know, like a wrestler or you know, judo guy versus a capoeira guy, you know, stuff like that. So but as the sport, you know, evolved, guys got more well-rounded. Back then, the guys that had a couple of disciplines actually, you know, they excelled back then. But really, like, who dominated was Royce Gracie, because Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu wasn't really known like that, not in the States. And you got this smaller guy, Royce Gracie. I think Royce was like 170 pounds at the time. I think he's like 6 feet tall. Don't quote me on that, but not a muscled guy. You know what I mean? And Royce was just like beating these monsters. You know, people didn't even understand what he was doing. I remember like back in the day during his fights, like people will call them fixed. They wouldn't understand what was happening. They're like, what the hell is that? Oh, that guy gave up. He was paid off. You know, it could be like a, you know, rear naked, whatever it is. Royce was like utilizing techniques that just people, they didn't understand. So he changed the game. And Joe Rogan talked about this. He pointed out two of the possible most important figures in martial arts. Like one of them is Bruce Lee. The other one in a big way is Royce Gracie. And for those of you guys who don't know, the Gracie family actually chose Royce because he was less physically imposing than their best member at the time, which was Rickson Gracie. And Rickson is like known to be the greatest Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, you know, out of the Gracie family. Highly regarded. Yeah, BJJ master, but they didn't want to use Rickson because Rickson had a build to him. You know, he was kind of muscular. He looked intimidating. Royce was the perfect guy to display Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And it was crazy. Yeah, it was a big impact. But going back to the main topic, I was just like mesmerized by these things. You know, back in the day, I was more into savagery. You know, I was attracted to violence and watching these guys kill each other. Like, I really didn't have respect for them as competitors like that. Not until I started training. And then I got like, you know, more of a respect for these martial artists and competitors. But I was like really young. Yeah, the UFC was going. It was actually banned at one point from pay-per-view, which is like it was a big deal. It actually almost ended the UFC. And what kept the UFC alive, you know, was the forums, the online mixed martial arts forums. You had Sherdog back in the day. That was a really big one. I don't know if Sherdog is the biggest still, but Sherdog has been around forever. And, you know, guys posting highlights, posting media, having discussions, pretty much kept the sport alive until it got back on pay-per-view. The Ultimate Fighter was a big leap for the UFC, helping them get mainstream. But back in the day, there were other events. There was Pancrase. Pride FC was probably UFC's biggest competitor. I think Pride was actually bigger than the UFC. I loved Pride. I loved Pride more than the UFC at the time. I used to catch all those Pride events, man. All those Pride events. They had such amazing freaking fighters. Like, if some of these guys are competing now in the UFC, they would just be absolutely tremendous stars. You know, you had Kazushi Sakuraba, the Gracie Hunter. They called him that because he beat like several, you know, Gracie members. And Sako was amazing. He was like undersized for a lot of his fights. He took on pretty much all comers, and his, you know, his career suffered because of that, his health, but he was such a warrior. Like he really embraced that Japanese samurai spirit, so beloved. But Sako actually competed in the UFC. I think he won by armbar. I think he had like one fight in the UFC, but Sako was a huge star in Pride. Who else we had in Pride? I mean, of course, we had Rampage, we had Shogun Hua, we had Murillo Ninja, his brother. Who else? Igor Vovchanchin, who was like this 5'8", 235-pound heavyweight. Maybe it was like 240. Just a little fire hydrant of a guy, you know, a giant killer. He had crazy knockout power. He's from Ukraine, I believe. And his fists looked like lunch boxes. Crazy fights with Igor, man. I remember a fight with Rampage, though. Rampage was just like slamming him all over the ring. And I remember Igor got injured in that fight. I think he like broke a rib. But yeah, Pride was amazing. You had Crow Cop, of course. Vanderlei Silva was running amok. He was the light heavyweight champ. And it was like you had the UFC going, and then you had Pride. And I remember it was like a team thing, almost like team sports. It was Team Pride, Team UFC, and guys will argue online all the time, like, "Oh, who got the best fighters? Is it Pride? Is it UFC?" At the time, I believe the UFC, Pride did. And then they had like a crossover fight where Dana White had a bet. I forgot I think it was with the Pride president at the time. I think it was like $100,000 or $150,000. They had like a tournament, and Chuck Liddell came over from the UFC. So Dana had like this side wager that Chuck is gonna either beat Rampage or win the tournament or whatever. Chuck comes in, pretty epic crossover. You know, had a great battle with Rampage. Of course, he lost that fight. And I think the Pride actually screwed over the UFC because they were supposed to send somebody over to compete. I forgot who it was. It may have been Vanderlei, and they kind of reneged on it. But that was another fight that people wanted to see, Vanderlei versus Chuck Liddell. Of course, that eventually happened in the UFC. But I think those guys fought like 5 years too late, you know. But continuing. Yeah, those were the golden years of MMA, man. The Pride Grand Prix were just epic. They had open weight Grand Prix. At the time, my favorite fighters, well, one of them was Vanderlei Silva. Vanderlei was my favorite fighter for years and years. One of the most violent mixed martial artists of all time. Just a complete psychopath in there. You know, some guys... GSP's talked about this. I think GSP did. Definitely on the Rogan, they've talked about this. But you have like athletes that compete, and you have fighters. Vanderlei was a fighter, and it seemed like he enjoyed hurting people. Just that absolute freaking savage. And you know, in Pride they had soccer kicks and head stomps, just brutal stuff. Vanderlei would just squash people, these Japanese fighters. It was nuts. Yeah, that was the golden era, man. That was the golden era of mixed martial arts. And then Pride went under. That was like super sad, super bummer for me, like total end of an era. UFC bought them out. The cool part was that you had some of these Pride fighters that came over, you know, Shogun Hua, Rampage. Same thing happened. Oh, Dan Henderson competed in Pride. Yeah, that was the cool aspect, that you finally got to see some of these Pride fighters compete in the UFC. That was my favorite time of MMA, when Pride and the UFC were competitors. It kind of was like WCW and wrestling, Monday Night Wars against WWF or WWE as they're called now. It was just like that. It was just like that, man. We have modern MMA what it is today. But some of the pioneers, if I could talk about some of the guys that were super well-rounded from back then, that if you could snatch them up in a time machine from back then, put them in today's era, and they would do well. Bas Rutten. Basra, an absolute legend of the sport, one of the greatest mixed martial artists of all time, in my opinion. Boss was this stand-up fighter, like super devastating striker. Boss has stated that he likes to make every strike count. There's nothing light or soft that Boss throws. You know what I mean? Everything he throws, he wants to do damage. Otherwise, it's a waste. That was his philosophy back then. But he had a weakness. It was his ground game. And Ken Shamrock actually exposed that multiple times. I believe he tapped out Boss with 2 knee bars on 2 separate occasions. And after that, Boss just went, he just went haywire with the ground training. He vowed to never be submitted again, or to get really, really proficient in grappling. And he did. Boss is like an aficionado on the ground. He's amazing. And of course, with that wicked stand-up. But yeah, Boss is a legend. He turned into like this super well-rounded fighter. Frank Shamrock back in the day. Frank was one of those first guys who implemented like extreme conditioning, and it was his cardio and conditioning that pretty much defeated Tito Ortiz in the UFC. Yeah, so Frank was a pioneer for that, the cardio and conditioning. Not to mention he had a kickboxing background, like training with Maurice Smith, who's an accomplished kickboxer. And then his grappling training pioneer along with Ken Shamrock. But Ken put Frank on the leg lock game, and they're both pioneers, along with Dean Lister. And leg locks became like a thing, as we all know, like, in recent years. Husamar Paul Harris became like a just absolute monster, and guys like took it to like another level. You got Ryan Hall's pretty nasty. Where am I going with this? I'm kind of drifting. Talking about the complete fighters. Yeah, Frank Shamrock came in with the cardio and conditioning. Who else was a pretty well-rounded guy? Vanderlei had some holes. He brought holes over into the UFC, the wrestling and grappling. Mirko Cro Cop, he was better. I think by the time he came over into the UFC, I don't know if he was like out of his prime. He definitely was better in Pride. I mean, there's differences with the ring and the cage. Maybe that's what it is, because with the cage, the cage is basically a weapon. You could get pinned up against the cage and kind of crushed there and stuck. That's something you have to worry about. The ring, it really doesn't happen. Back in the day in Pride, the refs would kind of like push you off the ropes. It was funny. They would like untangle you. And they also had, this is a complete side note, they had something called a yellow card. And it was pretty cool because like in Pride, they had like the first round was 10 minutes. And, after that, I think there were like 5-minute rounds. But I know the first round was really long. And they had yellow cards. And yellow cards were given to you. I think it was like 10% of your purse if you're stalling. So it forced guys to fight hard, Somebody else came to mind, another guy that I absolutely loved and idolized back then, that inspired me to train. Carlos Newton, the Ronin. Carlos Newton developed, pretty decent stand-up. He wasn't like a great striker like that, but he certainly had dangerous stand-up. He was super athletic, and his jiu-jitsu was like super ahead of its time, him with leg locks as well. Carlos Newton is the man. That's a guy that, if they brought him over, he was also super physically fit as well. So that's a guy, if you could put him in a time machine and drop him into the UFC today. He did compete in the UFC though. He was the welterweight champion. That's like that famous knockout when he had Matt Hughes in a triangle choke, a standing triangle, and Hughes like walked with him, got him against the cage and slammed him. And they actually both went unconscious, and Hughes came to first, so they gave him the win. Isn't that crazy? Carlos Newton put him in today's mixed martial arts, and I believe he was such an athlete. He would have picked up on current training methods, and definitely could have won some fights for sure. Trying to think what else I could rant about from back in the day. There was just so many colorful characters back in the day. Some of you guys remember Minnow Man with his battles with Phil Baroni. Phil's like, go get your shoe shine box. Like super crazy promos, man. Phil Baroni was just a wild dude. Said some crazy stuff. Minnow Man, who else was there? Genki Sudo was super entertaining. I felt like Genki was ahead of his time. He actually competed in the UFC as well. Fabricio Verdun competed in Pride. He was super young. He had like zero stand up. And yeah, he evolved into like one of the greatest heavyweights to ever compete. You know, he got some pretty formidable striking. Anyway, guys, I don't really know what else to say. Started drifting towards the end. But yeah, that Pride UFC rivalry was my favorite era of MMA. Very fond memories of it. I was like a young man. I just started training myself at the time. Very inspired by like the fighters of that era. But in the comment section, you guys let me know, you know, what year or what era did you start watching mixed martial arts? I would love to read those comments. Who were your favorite fighters? Who inspired you? What fights do you remember? Yeah, it would be awesome to read those stories, guys. Thanks for listening to the segment, guys. If you enjoyed it, hit that subscribe or follow button. Appreciate it, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.